there is a profound, suffocating isolation that comes with driving a 40-ton machine through the dead of night. When the radio bleeds into static and the thick, black fog rolls over the asphalt to swallow your headlights, you realize just how alone you truly are. Out there in the dark, the rules of civilized society vanish, replaced by the cold, unforgiving laws of survival. Welcome back to Channel 19 Mysteries. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. Tonight, we're taking a journey down one of the most treacherous stretches of road on the planet. It's a place where ruthless predators stalk innocent drivers under the cover of darkness. But recently, a new legend has emerged from the mist. A massive, silent force dispensing brutal, unexplained justice to those who prey on the weak. Are they a highly funded Black Ops mercenary squad? Or are they something spectral, vengeful spirits protecting their own? Before we ride into the fog, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment down below with your own theories on tonight's mystery. Now, let's get into tonight's stories. The Ghost Convoys. If you were to take a map of South Africa and trace a line between the bustling coastal port of Durban and the sprawling high-altitude economic hub of Johannesburg, your finger would follow the N3 highway. By day, this massive arterial route is a lifeline. It is a stunningly beautiful drive that cuts right through the heart of the KwaZulu-Natal Midlands, winding its way up the treacherous, winding inclines of Van Riemen's Pass, and spilling out onto the vast, golden plains of the Free State. It is the blood vessel that keeps the country's economy beating, carrying thousands of tons of cargo every single day. But when the sun dips below the horizon and the thick, suffocating mist rolls down from the Drakensberg Mountains, the N3 undergoes a terrifying transformation. It ceases to be a simple highway and becomes one of the most dangerous, lawless stretches of asphalt in the world. For the men and women who drive the massive 18-wheelers through the dead of night, the darkness brings predators. Heavily armed, highly organized syndicates known as night raiders or blue light gangs stalk these roads. They are ruthless. They use spikes to blow out tires. They drop boulders from overpasses. And sometimes, they simply pull alongside a moving truck in unmarked vehicles and open fire with fully automatic assault rifles until the driver is forced to pull over. The cargo they steal, electronics, high-grade copper wire, pharmaceuticals, is worth millions. But to the raiders, the lives of the drivers are worth absolutely nothing. However, over the last few years, a new whisper has begun to circulate through the truck stops and roadside diners along the route. It is a rumor that is spoken about in hushed, reverent tones. Drivers who have found themselves caught in the deadly crosshairs of these hijacking syndicates have reported being saved by something impossible. They call them the Ghost Convoys, or the Phantom Haulers. According to the legends, just as a driver is about to be violently ambushed and killed, massive, unmarked, matte black tractor trailers materialize out of the thick fog. They run without headlights, completely silent, until the very last second, and they intervene with brutal, lethal, and clinical efficiency. And then, just as quickly as they arrive, they vanish back into the mist, leaving behind only spent shell casings and a chilling, unexplained peace. Are they supernatural entities, the restless spirits of murdered truckers returning to protect their own? Or are they a highly illegal, heavily funded phantom mercenary group hired by desperate logistics conglomerates to dispense vigilante justice where the law has failed? To understand the sheer terror and the baffling mystery of the Phantom Haulers, you have to look at what happened to a veteran driver named Pieter van Zyl. Pieter was a man who knew every crack, every pothole, and every dangerous blind corner of the N3. By the time the spring rolled around, specifically on the evening of October 12th, 2019, Pieter had been driving long-haul routes for nearly 25 years. He was a large, quiet man in his late 50s, with a thick salt and pepper beard and hands that were permanently calloused from decades of gripping a heavy steering wheel. Pieter drove for an independent logistics firm, and he took immense pride in his spotless safety record. He was not a man prone to tall tales, panic, or exaggeration. If Pieter told you it was raining, you didn't even bother to look out the window. You just grabbed an umbrella. On the evening of October 12th, 2019, Pieter was tasked with a highly sensitive run. His rig, a massive, meticulously maintained Volvo FH600, was hitched to a reinforced trailer carrying nearly 2 million rand worth of processed copper cabling. Copper is practically gold on the black market in South Africa. It is highly sought after by syndicates who melt it down and ship it overseas. Pieter knew that the moment he pulled out of the secure loading depot in Durban, a target was painted squarely on his back. He did his pre-trip inspection with agonizing thoroughness. He checked his air brakes, he checked his tires, and he verified that his panic button, which linked directly to his dispatcher and a private security response team, was fully functional. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, under a heavy, overcast sky, Pieter climbed into the cab, released the massive air brakes with a loud, hissing sigh, and pulled out onto the highway. For the first few hours, the drive was entirely routine. Pieter listened to a talk radio station to keep his mind sharp. The steady, rhythmic thrum of the massive diesel engine beneath him, serving as a familiar, comforting lullaby. He passed through the city of Pietermaritzburg without incident and began the long, steady climb toward the Midlands. But as the clock crept past midnight, moving into the early, desolate hours of October 13th, 2019, the weather took a drastic turn for the worse. As Pieter approached the notorious stretch of highway near Moy River, a dense, swirling fog rolled in over the hills. This wasn't just a light mist. This was thick, impenetrable soup. The kind of fog that reflects your headlights straight back into your own eyes, creating a blinding white wall. Visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. Pieter was forced to drop his speed to a crawl, leaning forward over the steering wheel, his eyes straining to follow the faint, glowing cat's eyes on the asphalt. The radio signal died, leaving him in total silence, save for the low rumble of his engine and the erratic sweeping of his windshield wipers. The isolation was absolute. On nights like this, the N3 feels entirely disconnected from the rest of the world, like a lonely ribbon of pavement floating in a dark, empty void. It was right around 2:15 in the morning when Pieter noticed the first sign that something was horribly wrong. Through the thick, swirling fog ahead, he saw the faint, erratic strobing of blue lights. Now, to a civilian driver, blue flashing lights mean the police. They mean safety. But to a veteran trucker in South Africa, blue lights in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night, are an immediate red flag. The hijacking syndicates frequently use counterfeit police lights to trick drivers into pulling over. Pieter's heart rate spiked. He immediately reached for his two-way radio to call his dispatcher and alert them of a potential intercept. But all he got was dead static. The fog and the terrain had created a dead zone. Or, worse, the hijackers were using a localized signal jammer. As Pieter crept closer, his massive headlights finally cut through the gloom just enough to reveal the scene ahead. It wasn't a police roadblock. Two dark, unmarked pickup trucks were parked diagonally across the left and center lanes, effectively barricading the highway. Spilled across the only open lane on the far right was a line of jagged, vicious-looking metal spikes, welded together specifically to shred the heavy, reinforced tires of a commercial truck. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. If Pieter hit the brakes hard, his 40-ton rig would jackknife on the wet tarmac, likely flipping the truck and killing him instantly. If he tried to plow through the pickup trucks, the impact would destroy his radiator and completely disable his engine, leaving him a sitting duck. And if he drove over the spikes, his tires would blow, and he would grind to a violent, uncontrollable halt. He had mere seconds to decide. Relying on decades of instinct, Pieter gripped the steering wheel tight, downshifted to use engine braking, and aimed his massive rig straight for the spikes, hoping the momentum of the truck would carry him far enough away from the ambush point. The impact was violently jarring. Bang, bang, bang. 3 of his front left tires detonated simultaneously with the force of small bombs. The heavy steering wheel jerked wildly in his hands, nearly snapping his wrists. The entire rig shuddered and groaned, listing heavily to the left as the shredded rubber flapped violently against the wheel wells. Sparks showered the dark highway as the bare metal rims ground into the asphalt. Pieter wrestled with the massive machine, fighting gravity and momentum, until the truck finally groaned to a screeching, hissing halt about 100 yards past the barricade. He was stranded, he was completely alone, and he was entirely defenseless. Before Pieter could even reach under his seat for the heavy tire iron he kept for protection, he saw them in his side mirrors. Emerging from the fog behind his rig were 5 men. They were dressed in dark, tactical clothing, their faces obscured by balaclavas. And in their hands, Pieter could clearly see the long, unmistakable silhouettes of AK-47 assault rifles. They weren't rushing. They were walking with the terrifying, slow confidence of predators who knew their prey was trapped. One of the men raised his rifle and fired a short, 3-round burst into the air. The deafening cracks echoed loudly in the damp night air. A clear message: do not try to run, or you will die. Pieter locked the heavy steel doors of his cab, his hands shaking so violently he could barely operate the locks. He retreated to the back of the sleeper cabin, pressing himself against the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He closed his eyes and began to pray, knowing full well that the flimsy fiberglass and glass of the cab would offer zero protection against military-grade ammunition. He listened to the heavy, crunching footsteps of the armed men approaching the driver's side door. He heard one of them shout something in a language he couldn't quite make out, followed by the terrifying sound of a rifle bolt being racked back. But then, the most inexplicable thing happened. The men stopped shouting. The footsteps paused. Through the thin walls of his cab, Pieter felt a sudden, massive vibration in the air. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a deep, physical tremor that rattled the loose change in his cup holders and vibrated in the marrow of his bones. It felt like an earthquake, but the rhythm was too steady. It was the synchronized, monstrous churning of an incredibly massive diesel engine, operating at a dangerously high RPM. Pieter slowly opened his eyes and crawled toward the front window, peering cautiously over the dashboard. The fog directly in front of his crippled rig seemed to be parting, physically displaced by something enormous, moving toward them at a terrifying speed. But there were no headlights. There were no running lights. The darkness was absolute. Suddenly, less than 50 feet away from Pieter's windshield, a wall of blinding, intensely bright LED lights ignited all at once. The sudden illumination was so intense it was almost physical, turning the foggy night into brilliant, stark daylight. Behind the blinding wall of light, Pieter could just make out the shape of the machine. It was a truck, but unlike any truck he had ever seen in his life. It was a massive, custom-built tractor unit painted entirely in a matte, light-absorbing black. It had no company logos, no license plates, and no identifying markers of any kind. The front grille was heavily modified, protected by thick, welded steel bars that looked capable of plowing through a concrete wall without denting. The windows were deeply tinted, completely hiding the interior of the cab. The Phantom rig didn't slow down. It didn't honk its horn. It simply materialized out of the ether and drove directly, unapologetically, toward the armed hijackers who were standing next to Pieter's truck. The raiders, temporarily blinded by the sudden explosion of light and deafened by the roar of the massive engine, panicked. They raised their rifles and opened fire on the black truck. Pieter watched in absolute disbelief as sparks flew off the windshield and the front grille of the Phantom rig. The bullets were doing absolutely nothing. The glass was clearly highly rated ballistic armor, and the armor plating on the body simply shrugged off the assault rifle fire. The black truck didn't swerve. It aggressively, violently corrected its course, aiming the massive steel battering ram on its front end directly at the lead hijacker. The raiders broke and ran, diving frantically off the side of the highway and tumbling down the steep embankment into the darkness of the dense brush below. The massive black rig slammed on its brakes, coming to a sudden, controlled halt, positioned perfectly between Pieter's crippled truck and the edge of the embankment where the raiders had fled. It sat there, idling, the engine purring with a deep, menacing growl. For nearly 5 minutes, nobody moved. Pieter stayed completely frozen inside his cab, terrified that whoever was driving this monster of a machine might turn their attention to him next. He watched the dark, tinted windows of the phantom truck, waiting for a door to open, waiting for heavily armed men to step out, but the doors never opened. Instead, Pieter heard the distinct, terrifying sound of heavy gunfire erupting from the darkness of the embankment below. But it wasn't the erratic, spray-and-pray automatic fire of the hijackers. It was the slow, methodical, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of high-caliber, suppressed weapons. Someone or something was hunting the raiders in the dark brush. Screams echoed from the valley below, followed by brief, frantic bursts of return fire from the hijackers, which were quickly and ruthlessly silenced by the methodical, suppressed thumps. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. Then, the valley fell dead silent. Pieter didn't dare breathe. He watched as the massive black truck sat idling in front of him. Suddenly, the blinding array of LED lights snapped off, plunging the highway back into near-total darkness. The deep, rumbling engine roared, the heavy gears shifted with a loud clank, and the phantom rig slowly pulled forward. As the massive black trailer passed his window, Pieter strained his eyes, looking for any detail, any clue as to who his saviors were. But the trailer was just as blank and matte black as the cab. Within seconds, the enormous machine slipped back into the thick, swirling fog. The sound of its massive engine faded rapidly, swallowed up by the mist and the night, until there was absolutely nothing left but the sound of Pieter's own jagged breathing and the hiss of his ruined tires. It was over. The Ghost Convoy had come, intervened with devastating precision, and vanished without a trace. It took another 45 minutes for the police to finally arrive at the scene, responding to the emergency beacon Pieter had finally managed to trigger on his backup satellite unit. When Captain Thabo Makona, a veteran investigator with the South African Police Service, arrived on the scene, he found Pieter van Zyl sitting in the cab of his truck, physically unharmed but in a state of profound clinical shock. Captain Makona and his team immediately secured the area and began to piece together what had happened. When Pieter recounted his story, the spikes, the armed men, the sudden appearance of the heavily armored black rig, and the methodical gunfire in the valley, the police officers exchanged deeply skeptical looks. They assumed Pieter, terrified out of his mind, had hallucinated the intervention, or perhaps another trucker had driven past and simply fired a warning shot to scare the hijackers away. But when daylight broke, the physical evidence told a story that left Captain Mokoena completely baffled. They found the spiked barricade exactly where Pieter said it was. They found the deep gouges in the asphalt from Pieter's blown tires. But when the forensic team moved to the embankment and descended into the thick brush where the hijackers had fled, the mystery deepened into something truly chilling. They found blood, a lot of it. Heavy blood trails were leading deep into the dense, thorny vegetation, indicating that several of the raiders had been severely wounded. But there were no bodies. Whoever had engaged them had either dragged them away or the raiders had somehow managed to crawl miles through the bush despite catastrophic injuries. Furthermore, the forensic unit recovered dozens of spent shell casings scattered along the ridge. They were not standard civilian or police issue ammunition. The casings were military-grade, armor-piercing rounds, typically only used by highly specialized elite military units or heavily funded private military contractors. But the most disturbing piece of evidence, or rather, the lack of it, was on the highway itself. The police combed the wet asphalt, looking for tire tracks that belonged to the massive, armored black rig Pieter had described. A truck that heavy, performing an aggressive, sliding stop on wet tarmac, should have left deep, unmistakable tread marks. There was absolutely nothing. Aside from the gouges left by Pieter's ruined wheels, the surface of the highway was completely clean. There were no tracks, no oil drips, no physical indication whatsoever that the phantom rig had ever been there. Captain Mokoena eventually had to close the file as an attempted hijacking was thwarted by unknown persons. But off the record, he admitted to his colleagues that the incident chilled him to the bone. The absolute lack of a physical footprint left by such a massive machine was logically impossible. If Pieter Van Zil's story were an isolated incident, it could have been written off as a bizarre, adrenaline-fueled hallucination, a ghost story born out of the sheer trauma of a near-death experience. But it was not an isolated incident. In fact, it was just the beginning of a pattern. Nearly 2 years later, on the bitterly cold night of July 23rd, 2021, the phantom haulers struck again, this time hundreds of miles further up the N3, near the desolate town of Harrismith. The driver in this incident was a young man named Sipho Dlamini. Sipho was only 26 years old, a relatively new driver who had only been on the long-haul routes for about 18 months. He was driving a refrigerated rig, transporting a highly valuable shipment of life-saving pharmaceutical supplies, mostly expensive antibiotics and specialized vaccines, from a manufacturing plant in Johannesburg down to the hospitals in Durban. The cargo made him a prime target. The pharmaceutical black market is incredibly lucrative, and the syndicates are known to be particularly violent when attempting to secure medical shipments. It was exactly 11:45 at night when Sipho's nightmare began. Unlike Pieter's encounter, which relied on stealth and a spiked barricade, Sipho was hit while moving at nearly 60 miles per hour. He was navigating a long, relatively straight stretch of highway when an unmarked dark gray SUV suddenly accelerated from an on-ramp and pulled up aggressively on his right side, matching his speed perfectly. Sipho glanced out his passenger window, expecting to see a reckless civilian driver. Instead, he saw the passenger side window of the SUV roll down, revealing a man leaning out of the vehicle, holding a massive pump-action shotgun. Before Sipho could even react, the man racked the shotgun and fired directly at the cab of the truck. The heavy slug shattered the passenger side window, tearing through the cabin and burying itself in the heavy padding of the sleeper berth, missing Sipho's head by less than 6 inches. The sound inside the enclosed cab was deafening. Glass sprayed everywhere, cutting into Sipho's face and arms. "Pull over! Pull the truck over now!" A voice screamed over a megaphone from the SUV, even as the man with the shotgun prepared to fire again. Sipho was terrified, but he knew the unwritten rule of the road. If they want you to pull over out here, they intend to kill you. You do not stop. Sipho slammed his foot down on the accelerator, pushing his heavy rig to its absolute maximum limit. The massive diesel engine roared in protest, but the truck slowly gained speed. The SUV kept pace effortlessly, the driver expertly maneuvering the smaller vehicle to stay glued to the side of the massive trailer. The man with the shotgun fired again. This time, the slug hit the front right tire of the tractor unit. The reinforced rubber held for a fraction of a second before violently bursting. The steering wheel was violently ripped from Sipho's grasp. The massive rig swerved hard to the right, crossing the emergency lane and crashing violently into the heavy steel guardrail lining the side of the highway. The friction generated a massive shower of orange sparks as the steel of the truck scraped against the barrier. The entire rig shuddered violently, throwing Sipho against his seatbelt before finally grinding to a smoking, hissing halt. Sipho was bleeding from the glass cuts, completely disoriented and trapped. His driver's side door was pinned hard against the mangled guardrail, making it impossible to open. The only way out was through the passenger door, directly into the line of fire of the hijackers. The dark SUV slammed on its brakes, skidding to a halt a few yards in front of the crippled truck. 4 men poured out of the vehicle, heavily armed with a mix of shotguns and handguns. They began moving quickly toward the cab of the truck, shouting aggressively. Sipho scrambled backward, retreating as far into the sleeper cabin as he could, curling himself into a tight ball, waiting for the inevitable burst of gunfire that would end his life. He closed his eyes tightly, and then, just like Pieter Van Zyl had experienced 2 years prior, the air pressure on the highway fundamentally changed. Sipho didn't hear an engine at first. What he heard was a sound like a massive rushing wind, followed by a terrifying, heavy, metallic screech. He opened his eyes and looked through the shattered remnants of his windshield. The 4 heavily armed hijackers had stopped dead in their tracks. They were staring past Sipho's truck, looking down the dark highway behind him. Their aggressive posture completely vanished, replaced instantly by absolute, unadulterated panic. Suddenly, An impossibly bright array of LED floodlights bathed the entire scene in stark, blinding white light. The light was coming from directly behind Sipho's trailer. The hijackers didn't even attempt to raise their weapons. They turned and sprinted desperately back toward their SUV. But before they could even reach the doors of their vehicle, a massive, monolithic shape emerged from the darkness behind Sipho's rig. It was a truck. It was completely painted in light-absorbing matte black. It had no identifying marks, no license plates, and a heavily armored steel grille that looked like the battering ram of a medieval siege engine. The Phantom rig did not use its brakes. It did not slow down to intimidate. It accelerated. Moving with terrifying silent grace, the massive black tractor unit swerved out from behind Sipho's trailer and violently, purposefully slammed into the side of the hijacker's dark gray SUV. The impact was catastrophic. The sheer mass and momentum of the armored rig crushed the smaller vehicle like an empty soda can, launching the crumpled wreckage off the highway and sending it tumbling violently down the embankment. Two of the hijackers who had not made it to the SUV were caught in the open. They desperately raised their weapons and fired wildly at the black truck. Once again, the bullets pinged harmlessly off the heavily armored glass and steel bodywork. The Phantom truck didn't even flinch. It came to a violently abrupt, perfect halt, effectively placing its massive, bulletproof bulk between Sipho's crippled rig and the armed men. Sipho watched in stunned silence as a small, barely noticeable hatch on the side of the black trailer suddenly slid open. From the darkness of the hatch, a single, sustained burst of suppressed automatic gunfire erupted. It was incredibly fast, impossibly precise, and deadly quiet. The two hijackers in the open dropped the asphalt instantly, neutralized before they could even register where the shots had come from. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hiss of Sipho's blown tire and the quiet, idling hum of the massive black rig. The black truck sat there for precisely 60 seconds, its blinding lights illuminating the carnage on the highway. Then, exactly as it had done with Pieter Van Zyl, the lights snapped off. The engine let out a low, vibrating roar, and the massive machine smoothly accelerated down the highway, fading into the darkness until it completely disappeared, as if the night had simply swallowed it whole. When the authorities arrived to extract Sipho from his wrecked cab, they found a scene that mirrored the impossible mystery of the Moy River incident. The destroyed SUV was at the bottom of the embankment, but the bodies of the two hijackers who had been shot on the asphalt were gone. Drag marks indicated they had been pulled into the brush by their surviving accomplices. The police found the suppressed shell casings once again, highly specialized, military-grade ammunition that was virtually impossible to procure on the civilian market. But most maddeningly, just like before, there was absolutely zero physical evidence that the massive black truck had ever existed. No tire tracks from the catastrophic impact with the SUV, no paint transfers on the wreckage, and no footage captured on any of the highway toll cameras up or down the N3 route. It was a physical impossibility. A 40-ton, heavily armored machine cannot ram a vehicle at highway speeds, engage in a firefight, and vanish into thin air without leaving a single trace of its presence. These incidents, and over a dozen other similar, highly classified reports buried deep in police files, have birthed a modern mythology along the South African highways. Two primary theories dominate the late-night conversations at the truck stops. The first theory is grounded in cold, hard, illegal reality. Some veteran drivers believe that the Ghost Convoys are a highly classified, totally deniable, illegal Black Ops security initiative. The theory goes that massive, multi-billion-dollar international logistics conglomerates, tired of losing millions of dollars to the hijacking syndicates and frustrated by the corrupt or inefficient local law enforcement, took matters into their own hands. They pooled their resources and hired elite private military contractors. Former special forces operatives with combat experience gave them heavily armored, unregistered rigs and set them loose on the N3 with one simple mandate: hunt the hunters. Eliminate the threat with extreme prejudice, leave no survivors, and leave no evidence. This would explain the military-grade weapons, the extreme precision of the engagements, and the absolute lack of any paper trail. It is a terrifying thought, a private, heavily armed vigilante army operating outside the bounds of any law, acting as judge, jury, and executioner in the dead of night. But then, there is this second theory. The theory that is whispered by the older drivers, the ones who have spent too many nights alone in the creeping fog of Van Reenen's Pass. They point to the absolute lack of tire tracks. They point to the impossible silence of a 40-ton machine moving at highway speeds before an ambush. They point to the fact that no toll booth, no traffic camera, and no satellite has ever captured an image of these black rigs. These drivers believe that the phantom haulers are not men at all. They believe that they are the manifestations of the highway itself. The restless, vengeful spirits of the hundreds of innocent drivers who have been brutally murdered by the night raiders over the decades. They believe that these phantom rigs cross over from the other side when the fog rolls in, serving as spectral guardians to protect the innocent from suffering the same gruesome fate they did. They arrive from nowhere, they deliver unearthly justice, and they fade back into the ether. The South African authorities officially deny the existence of any phantom vigilante groups, and they certainly do not entertain discussions about ghost trucks. They officially classify these events as inter-gang violence or disputed hijacking reports. But if you ever find yourself driving the dark, winding corridors of the N3 highway deep in the middle of the night, and the fog rolls over your windshield, reducing the world to a small, terrifying bubble of visibility, and if you suddenly feel the deep, vibrating thrum of a massive engine where there should be silence, and the road ahead erupts in a blinding, unearthly light, do not panic, do not run. Just pull over, lock your doors, and close your eyes, because the Ghost Convoy has arrived, and you do not want to see what happens to the people they came to hunt. What do you guys think is truly patrolling the N3? Are the phantom haulers ghostly guardians from beyond the grave, or a highly funded rogue mercenary group? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, I'm your host, Midnight Rider, and you've been watching Channel 19 Mysteries. If you enjoyed tonight's deep dive into the unknown, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next broadcast. Got a strange story of your own? If you've had any creepy encounters, unexplained sightings, or highway horrors, I want to hear about them. Send your stories directly to me at mycreepyencounter@gmail.com, and they might just be featured in an upcoming video. Until next time, keep your eyes on the road and stay safe out there.